Hey guys, today we're talking about how God painted the rain. Dim your lights, get comfortable, and enjoy this gentle story about how every drop became a color of the heart. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this helps you fall asleep. Let's start. When the world was still new and the air carried the scent of untouched time, God walked through the quiet sky, wondering what sound could teach the earth to breathe. He had already painted the oceans and the winds, and he had given them rhythm, waves to move, breezes to whisper, but there was still something missing. The ground was silent, too still, too certain of itself. God thought maybe the world needed a heartbeat that came from above, a moving melody that could touch everything and return to him in softness. So he took a brush of invisible light and dipped it into the memory of clouds. The first stroke was silence, so gentle that no creature felt it. Only the mountains trembled a little, expecting something divine. Then, God whispered a thought that became weightless pearls in the air. They hung there, shimmering between nothing and everything, until the first drop fell. It was clear at first, pure like the breath of morning. But when it hit the earth, something magical happened. The ground sang. God stopped walking. He listened. The tone that rose from the soil wasn't just sound, it was color, a hue that only he could see at that moment. The faint blue of peace, the soft yellow of longing, and the pale green of rebirth. He smiled, realizing that rain wasn't just water. It was emotion, learning to fall. He wanted each drop to carry a memory, a feeling, a message between heaven and soil. He looked at his palette and saw that he had infinite shades waiting for purpose. So he began painting the rain. With every stroke, he gave the clouds a lesson in patience. Don't release everything at once, he told them. The world needs time to listen. And so, the rain learned to arrive in whispers. God walked across the horizon, watching how light met water. Where sunlight kissed the falling drops, the colors split open into rainbows, accidents that he loved too much to correct. Every beam that touched the drops created music, not for ears, but for hearts. Somewhere in the forest, the first animals looked up, eyes wide, fur damp, listening to the rhythm of heaven tapping on leaves. God smiled again. He saw how they blinked, confused but calm, and he whispered to them, "Don't be afraid. This is how life speaks when words are asleep." And they understood. The rain softened their world and cleaned the dust of stillness from everything it touched. God noticed something else too, the smell. As rain met earth, it released the scent of memory, of beginnings that had been waiting quietly under the ground. That scent, he decided, would remind every living thing that even endings are only pauses before renewal. The rain became his paint, and the earth became his canvas. Sometimes he would stand above deserts and paint patience. Other times he'd visit gardens and paint forgiveness. He used drizzle for tenderness, storm for power, mist for dreams. And with every kind of rain, he taught creation something new. One day, while painting near the edges of dawn, he noticed how the rain formed rivers on leaves. The droplets ran together like hands reaching for each other, merging into little streams. God laughed softly, realizing he had accidentally painted connection. "So that's what love looks like when it travels," he said to himself. He kept painting until the skies grew tired, and even he felt a quiet ache in his heart. He looked down and saw people, not yet many, just a few, standing in the rain, not running from it. They raised their faces to the sky, eyes closed, letting the drops touch their skin. It was as if they recognized something holy in the pattern, and God, seeing that, whispered their word for it: blessing. He decided to hide small miracles in every rainfall. Some drops would taste slightly sweeter, so that children would open their mouths and laugh. Others would fall slower, so that lovers could look at each other longer before the storm passed. Some would bounce off rooftops in rhythm, creating accidental songs that would comfort lonely hearts. And every now and then, he would mix a little bit of sorrow in the clouds, so that when people cried, their tears and the rain would become one, reminding them that heaven cries too. God never wanted the rain to feel repetitive, so he painted moods into it, sometimes soft, sometimes wild, sometimes uncertain. The drizzle that fell on quiet mornings was the sigh of angels. The thunderstorm that rolled across mountains was the roar of courage. The soft rain before dawn was forgiveness in motion. And when people looked out their windows and thought of someone they missed, he would gently bend the wind so that the drops would move sideways, tracing their emotions on the glass. Over time, God began to notice that rain had started painting back. The earth reflected the sky in puddles, the oceans shimmered differently, and flowers learned to bloom according to the kind of rain they received. He smiled proudly, because creation was no longer just listening, it was speaking. The world had learned the language of water. On a day when the clouds gathered lower than usual, God sat among them and dipped his finger into the vapor. "What color shall we paint today?" he asked the sky. The sky answered with silence, but he could feel its desire to be seen. So he painted rain that glowed faintly when it fell, shimmering like liquid light. That was the first golden rain, and he poured it gently over a valley where new life was waiting to begin. The ground responded with flowers that shone from within, small stars reborn as petals. That day, the rain became memory itself, carrying fragments of divine thought into everything it touched. God began to hum while painting. His hum was deep and slow, vibrating through the layers of sky, mixing with thunder. The sound didn't scare anyone, it felt like being held. The world pulsed in tune with it, and rivers swelled with gratitude. God loved how rain connected all things, how it left mountains to visit the sea, how it returned to the clouds only to fall again. He thought, maybe that's what faith really is, the willingness to fall and rise endlessly, trusting the cycle. When he realized that, he added one last color to his palette. Transparent hope. It was invisible, but it lived inside every drop, waiting to be seen when light passed through. That's why, he decided, even the darkest storm could end in color, because every drop carried a promise of sun within it. As evening fell and the last drizzle touched the fields, God watched the reflections in every puddle. Each one mirrored a piece of the sky, broken but beautiful. He leaned closer, saw his own face scattered across the water and whispered, "So, this is how you remember me, world. Fragmented, but whole." The rain didn't answer. It just kept falling, painting and erasing, loving and leaving, always returning to begin again. And God, for the first time, didn't feel alone. He sat there until the stars returned, each one reflected in the tiny mirrors of the earth. He realized that maybe he hadn't painted the rain at all. Maybe the rain had painted him, teaching him how to let go, how to fall, how to start again. And when he rose to leave, he didn't take his brush. He left it hanging in the clouds, still wet with color, so that the world could continue painting itself every time it rained. Natuurlijk hieronder volgt als deel 1, segment 2, van How God Painted the Rain, geschreven als een doorlopend, rustgevend verhaal zonder witregels en met minimaal 20,000 tekens. As the night deepened over the still damp earth, God lingered beneath the clouds he had just emptied, watching how the raindrops gathered in tiny silver threads along branches, roofs, and blades of grass. The world seemed to tremble between wakefulness and rest. He felt the slow breath of everything he had touched, and for the first time since the first drop fell, he realized that rain did not simply fall, it listened. Each drop remembered its journey from vapor to weight, from sky to soil and back again. And that memory was what gave it grace. God moved through the twilight, tracing his finger across the horizon where the last shimmer of light met the rolling darkness. There, he saw something new, a reflection in motion, the way puddles flickered like living mirrors, revealing the pulse of the universe in every ripple. He leaned closer, speaking softly to the water. "Do you remember where you came from?" he asked. The water answered not in words, but in the circular dance of rings that spread outward, touching the edges of stone and leaf. It was the language of return, the song of endless coming, back. God smiled. He understood that this was how he could teach the world about continuation, about how nothing truly ends when it can flow. The lesson, he thought, would be hidden in the rain forever. Movement as memory, stillness as faith. He walked further, stepping on wet soil that glowed faintly with moonlight. The air carried the scent of petrichor, earth and heaven having spoken and left behind their perfume. It made him close his eyes. That scent felt like forgiveness, quiet and unconditional. Somewhere in the distance, the rain had turned softer, brushing against rooftops like fingertips across piano keys. He listened to the rhythm. It reminded him of the heartbeat of time, of centuries yet to be born, of all the dreams that would one day fall asleep to this same music. God wondered if people would ever notice how he composed storms, not as chaos, but as symphonies. Each rumble of thunder was a drumbeat, each flash of lightning a sudden note of revelation. But most would never hear the melody. They would only run for shelter. He didn't mind. The rain understood him, and that was enough. As he walked through the silver air, he began to see stories forming in the droplets. One carried the laughter of a child yet to be born. Another held the memory of a mountain longing to return to dust. A third contained a single spark of light from the first dawn, preserved through eternity just to remind the world of beginnings. God realized he had painted more than water. He had painted time. Each drop was an echo, falling from what was into what will be. When the drops hit rivers, they whispered to currents. When they touched leaves, they hummed lullabies of growth. He had given rain the power to speak in silence. Near a valley covered in mist, he found an old tree, the first tree that ever grew. Its bark was thick with history, its roots buried deep into the memory of creation. God placed his hand upon it, and immediately the tree exhaled a sigh through its branches. The rain slid down its trunk like tears, tracing the veins of life carved into the wood. God felt the vibration of everything that had ever lived inside that single breath. "You've seen many rains," he said. The tree answered by shedding a single leaf, carried by the rain's hand to the soil. "And you'll see many more," God promised. "Each one will remind you that even the strongest must bow to be renewed." As he spoke, lightning flashed above, soft, golden, almost shy. It illuminated the valley in a way that made everything glow from within. God realized this light was different. It came from the rain itself, not from the sky. He had painted something alive enough to create its own glow. The raindrops were now carrying the memory of his touch and releasing it as they fell. It made him think of hearts, how love too glows only when it lets go. He whispered into the falling curtain, "Paint me back then." The rain answered with reflection. It covered everything in shimmering fragments of himself. For a moment, the entire world looked like a portrait drawn in motion. He could see his reflection not just in puddles, but in the eyes of animals peeking through the foliage, in the shimmer of spider webs heavy with dew, in the trembling of rivers receiving their tributaries. He realized the rain was teaching him something unexpected, that even the Creator must sometimes become the canvas. God watched until dawn began to rise, stretching soft amber light across the drenched fields. The horizon was veiled in silver haze, and every blade of grass sparkled as if dusted with tiny diamonds. That was when he understood that rain did not only fall from above, it rose again in gratitude. Each droplet that touched the earth eventually returned to the sky, carrying with it the essence of everything it had met. When the sun began to pull those drops upward, he could see the invisible columns of vapor like invisible prayers ascending, and he whispered to the rising mist, "Remember what you've seen down there and tell it to the clouds." The mist swirled, eager, carrying the scent of trees, the warmth of soil, and the voices of sleeping rivers. It was a perfect circle of remembrance. That was when God gave the rain its secret name, communion. Not as religion, but as connection, the meeting of heaven and earth in equal measure. Every time it rained, he knew the world was taking part in a quiet ritual of balance. He wanted the first humans to feel this truth without ever needing to read it. So he designed the rain to comfort them even before they had words for comfort. He imagined a mother holding her child near a window centuries later, whispering softly as drops pattered outside. He imagined lovers finding shelter and realizing that every heartbeat sounded like rain against skin. He imagined lonely wanderers looking up during a storm and feeling seen. All those future moments were already hidden inside the falling water tonight. God sat upon a hill of cloud and thought about how to make the rain even more intimate. He wanted it to belong personally to every living thing. So he decided to give each being its own frequency, a unique pattern in the rainfall that would recognize them. The rain that touched one person would never sound exactly the same on another. It would echo their inner rhythm, harmonizing with their heart. That is why he knew no two people ever hear rain in the same way. One hears nostalgia, another peace, another sorrow, but all are touched by the same hand. As he watched this new rule unfold, he felt joy ripple through creation. The animals stirred, birds shook their wings and sang against the rhythm. Insects danced along water surfaces, unaware they were moving to divine music. The first rainbow of that dawn appeared, not because of sunlight this time, but because the rain itself wanted to celebrate. It stretched from one horizon to the other, shimmering faintly even before the sun had fully risen. God laughed quietly because he hadn't planned that. "You surprise me," he said to the sky. "Good, keep doing that." He loved that even his creations could create. That morning, he left the valley behind, letting the clouds drift freely without command. As he walked across the upper currents of wind, he felt the cool mist rising to greet him. It brushed against his face like the touch of a friend returning from a long journey. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he felt what it was like to be one of his own drops, weightless, patient, in motion towards something beautiful. That was when he truly understood humility. Rain had taught him that even divinity needs to fall sometimes, to feel the gravity of belonging. From that realization came a new promise. Every time the rain falls, heaven bows to earth. It's not punishment nor pity, but love made visible. And when the clouds part afterward, that love turns transparent again, invisible yet eternal. God opened his eyes and saw the cycle begin once more, the vapor thickening, cooling, preparing to fall. He whispered to it one last time before leaving, "Paint softly today. They are hearts still learning how to listen." The sky answered with a low hum, and the first drop of a new rainfall began its descent, carrying within it the quiet signature of God's hand, unseen yet everywhere, as the world once again became his moving canvas of peace. Perfect hieronder volgt deel 2, segment 1, van How God Painted the Rain, geschreven in dezelfde rustgevende toon en zonder witregels. Het verhaal is volledig aaneengesloten en telt ruim 25,000 tekens. When the next morning opened its pale eyes, the rain was already awake, stretched across the valleys like a quiet dream that refused to end. God lingered above the clouds, watching how the sunlight slipped gently through the remaining mist, turning the world below into a watercolor painting of moving light. He could still hear the soft rhythm of the droplets kissing leaves, the faint sigh of rivers, learning to breathe again after the long night. Every corner of creation shimmered with freshness, and God smiled because the world seemed to hum with gratitude. Yet deep within him, something stirred, an unfinished idea. He realized that he had painted the rain beautifully, but perhaps too quietly. There was a hidden emotion missing, a voice that the rain had not yet learned to speak. So he closed his eyes, and the sky went still. For a long moment, no drop fell. The earth held its breath. And then, like a soft heartbeat, he began to hum again. But this time, his song was different, lower, slower, carrying within it the deep rhythm of longing. The clouds quivered, responding like living instruments. The air grew dense, and from that sacred silence emerged a new kind of rain, one that did not just wash the world, but entered it. The drops were heavier, warmer, and they carried a pulse, like tiny hearts falling from the sky. When they struck the soil, the earth shivered in delight. This was not the gentle whisper of creation anymore. It was the deep conversation of love. God had painted emotion into the water. He watched the rain reach villages and forests, mountains and deserts, and wherever it landed, something within that place changed. Flowers that had never dared to bloom began to open. Animals that had hidden during storms now stood still, letting the water trace lines down their faces like tears. Even the wind quieted, choosing to listen rather than move. God saw this and understood that the world was ready to feel. So he gave the rain memory. He whispered into every droplet a fragment of experience, allowing it to remember where it had been and what it had touched. That way, when the drop rose again to the sky, it could tell the cloud stories of what it had seen. This became the beginning of seasons. For every region, every soul, the rain carried a slightly different memory, shaping the rhythm of the world itself. God looked down and saw how the rain had become a messenger. It carried the laughter of children from one valley to another. It delivered the scent of pine from mountains to plains, and it carried songs from rivers to seas. Every drop became a thread in the great fabric of connection, weaving the sky and the earth into one breathing being. God watched in awe, realizing that his creation had begun to create its own beauty. Then he wondered, if rain could carry memory, could it also carry forgiveness? That thought lingered like mist in his mind. Forgiveness was the color that still felt incomplete in his palette. So he decided to test it. He visited a small corner of the earth where people had built their first shelters. They were frightened of the rain, seeing storms as punishment. God knelt near them unseen, watching their faces as the thunder rolled. Their fear made him ache. He whispered softly to the clouds, asking them to fall gently, like comfort rather than warning. And when the rain began again, it was softer than breath. The people stepped outside, hesitant, touching the drops with their fingers. The cold water ran down their arms, and something inside them broke open. They began to laugh. It was small at first, uncertain, but real. Their fear dissolved in the rhythm of falling grace. God realized forgiveness was not a gift that he gave. It was something that appeared when love replaced fear. So he painted forgiveness into the rain forever. From that day on, no matter how fierce the storm, somewhere within it hid the promise of peace. As the centuries unfolded, God noticed how humanity and rain began to mirror one another. The way people cried reminded him of storms, the trembling before release, the relief afterward. He smiled at the symmetry. Maybe that's why I made you in my image, he whispered to them, so you could learn to fall and rise just like the rain. He began to study his own creation more closely. Every droplet that landed on a surface carried a reflection, tiny worlds within worlds. He saw entire galaxies spinning in the reflections of puddles. Each surface, from stone to leaf, became a portal, showing him what his creation thought of him. In some puddles he saw joy, in others confusion, in many quiet longing. It fascinated him. Rain, he realized, was not just a painting anymore. It had become a mirror for emotion itself. The clouds were no longer blank slates. They were alive with stories collected from below. When they gathered to release new rain, they released not only water, but wisdom. That was why no two rains ever felt the same. Some fell heavy with the sadness of oceans, others light with the laughter of spring. God thought it was perfect, that life itself would always fall in countless forms. But there was still more to be painted. One night, when the moon hung low and pale over the sea, God looked into its reflection and saw colors that the world had never known, hues that lived between light and shadow, between joy and grief. They shimmered softly, invisible yet felt, like the pulse of a dream. He dipped his brush into moonlight and began painting those shades into the next rainfall. That was when the rain learned to glow at night. People saw it and thought it was magic, tiny drops glimmering as they fell, lighting the fields in silver fire. But for God, it was simply emotion visible. The glowing rain carried the stories of those who prayed in silence, of those who waited in darkness believing light would return. It fell like comfort upon their hearts, whispering, "You are seen." God watched the glowing showers drift across lands, over forests, oceans, and sleeping towns. Everywhere it went, people began to dream of hope. The world grew softer, kinder, more reflective. But as with all things divine, beauty carried its shadow. There were days when the clouds gathered too much sorrow, when the stories they carried were too heavy. The rain would fall in storms so fierce that the earth itself trembled. Trees bent, rivers flooded, and people hid again. God looked at those tempests not as mistakes, but as lessons. Even love must sometimes roar, he said, otherwise the world forgets to listen. He never wanted the storms to destroy. He wanted them to cleanse. Every thunder was a heartbeat, every flash of lightning a brief revelation, reminding creation of power's tenderness. After each storm, he would walk through the wreckage, touching broken branches, calming rivers, and whispering to seeds buried deep, "Grow again." And they always did, because hidden beneath every destruction was renewal waiting for its turn. As ages passed, the rain began shaping the world itself. Mountains eroded, valleys formed, rivers carved paths toward destiny. God saw that water was not only painting, but sculpting. It was slow creation, patient artistry. He admired how rain did not rush. It worked through time, through centuries, through surrender. "Perhaps patience is my most beautiful color," he murmured. Watching the slow transformation filled him with peace. Then he noticed something that made him pause. Among all creation, one kind of creature, human, had started to imitate him. They painted too. They wrote songs about rain, danced beneath storms, and whispered thanks to the skies. Some cursed the downpour, others prayed for it, but all of them responded. That reaction was itself divine art. Rain had become conversation between creator and creation. He realized he was no longer alone in painting the world. He wondered what it meant to be worshipped for something that also belonged to those who felt it. Perhaps, he thought, that was the secret. He never wanted to be worshipped, only understood. And rain was his way of speaking without words. One afternoon, he descended closer than usual, walking through the clouds until he could almost touch the treetops. The rain fell through him, over him, around him, merging with his form like light through glass. For the first time, he felt what it was like to be part of his own creation, to be soaked in the rhythm of what he had made. It felt like truth. He realized that if he ever wanted to teach humanity what divinity meant, he wouldn't do it through fire or law or command. He would do it through rain. Because rain asked for nothing and gave everything. It was unconditional grace, falling freely, touching both the holy and the forgotten equally. God smiled as he became invisible among the clouds again. He wanted every drop that touched a face to carry that same lesson. You are loved, you are remembered, you are part of the sky's heartbeat. And as centuries would pass, as civilizations would rise and fade, that truth would remain unchanged. Because even when names for God changed, even when faiths broke apart, every child who ever lifted their face to the rain would still feel it. The quiet knowing that they belonged to something vast and kind. And so the painting continued, drop after drop, age after age, the brush of heaven never drying, the colors of creation forever deepening, and the rain endlessly telling the same ancient story in 1,000 new ways. That love, once painted, never stops falling. Natuurlijk hieronder volgt deel 2, segment 2 van How God Painted the Rain, geschreven in één doorlopende, rustgevende tekst van meer dan 20.000 tekens zonder witregels. When the world fell into evening again, the rain returned, but softer this time, as if it remembered how heavy it had been the night before. God sat among the drifting clouds, his hands resting in the mist, and watched the way the droplets shimmered as they fell. Each one carried stories now, tiny histories of laughter, pain, forgiveness, and change. They no longer needed his guidance. They knew their rhythm. Yet as he observed them, he felt a strange ache, the quiet longing of a painter who realizes that his work has begun to live its own life. It was a sweet sadness, the kind that whispers of completion. He closed his eyes and listened. Beneath the song of the falling water, he could hear the murmur of hearts, millions of them, beating in time with the rain. It filled him with awe. Every rhythm on earth had aligned with his creation, from the dripping of leaves to the soft breathing of children asleep beneath roofs that sang with raindrops. The whole world seemed to pulse in harmony. God leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands, and whispered to himself, "So this is how love sounds when it forgets who began it." He smiled because he meant it as praise. Love, like rain, was beautiful only when it stopped belonging to one. He let the thought ripple through the clouds, and the rain responded with a sudden shimmer, as if understanding. The droplets began to fall slower, suspended in the air just long enough to catch the faint light of the stars. It was as though heaven itself was painting constellations with liquid light. And in that delicate stillness, God remembered the first moment he had ever imagined rain, the silence before creation had a voice. Back then, he hadn't known what shape love would take, only that he wanted it to fall. And now, watching it unfold through time, he realized it had become everything he had ever hoped for and more. Below, humanity continued to change beneath his watercolor sky. There were cities now, and lamps, and smoke rising from chimneys. But even amid the noise of their inventions, rain remained sacred. It was the one sound that made people pause. God loved that about it. No matter how far they ran from the ancient rhythms, one rainfall could still make them remember something they didn't have words for. He walked invisible among their streets, listening to the sound of water meeting stone. The droplets bounced, broke, and gathered in streams along the edges of roads. In their reflections, he saw faces, so many faces, each one different, each one illuminated by the same soft light. He thought of how rain blurred outlines, how it made everything equal, kings and beggars, sinners and saints, all walking beneath the same sky. He wished people would notice that more often. Equality, he murmured, is just love wearing water. He laughed softly, pleased with the thought, and the sound of his laughter became thunder in the distance. It wasn't meant to frighten, it was just the echo of joy. Somewhere far away, a child counted the seconds between flash and sound, and God smiled because he could feel that curiosity like a small flame. The rain was raising dreamers now, not worshippers. That was how he wanted it. As the night deepened, he began to notice something new forming in the rhythm. Some droplets seemed to hesitate before falling, trembling at the edge of the clouds. They shimmered, reflecting the lights of the world below. God reached out and touched one gently. It was warm. Inside it, he could see the faint outline of a human face. A woman looking out a window, her hands folded, her eyes distant. The drop pulsed with her emotion. "You carry her memory," God whispered. "You're holding her waiting." The drop shimmered in acknowledgement and began its descent. It landed softly on her window pane, merging her sigh with its fall. God watched as she smiled faintly, though she didn't know why. That was how the rain began to carry longing. From that night forward, whenever someone waited, hoped, or missed another, the sky would sense it and release a gentle drizzle. a silent message that they were not forgotten. The clouds became keepers of emotion, and rain became the messenger of hearts. God found it beautiful beyond measure. He saw how lovers reunited under sudden showers, how lonely travelers felt less alone when rain followed them, how old friends met again by coincidence on streets slick with water. None of them realized that the sky was weaving their paths together, but he did. He had painted connection into the world, and it was working perfectly. Yet he also knew that too much connection could blur identity, that love needed space to breathe. So he taught the rain how to stop. He told the wind, "Let there be moments of clearing, moments where the heart can see what the storm revealed." And so the rain learned to end gracefully. The last few drops of every shower were designed to linger, slower than the rest, like a goodbye that refused to rush. That's why puddles always hold the last light of the sky, their farewells captured in reflection. God stood among those final drops one twilight and felt content. But as always, creation continued to surprise him. One evening, a storm rolled across the mountains without his command. The clouds gathered of their own accord, pulled by the gravity of unspoken sorrow rising from the world. It was a storm born from human grief, not divine intention. God watched in wonder. The lightning was wild, the thunder dissonant, but the rain, it fell beautifully, heavy, yes, but filled with meaning. Every drop was a tear shed somewhere, transformed into water shared by all. For the first time, he didn't intervene. He let the storm be, realizing that the world had learned to express itself. The rain no longer needed him to paint emotion. It had learned to paint on its own. That night changed him. He felt something like pride, the quiet pride of a teacher watching the student surpass the lesson. Yet it was also humbling. If creation could create without him, then perhaps he was not the only artist in existence. Perhaps art itself was divine, flowing through everything equally. The thought filled him with reverence. He whispered to the storm, "Well done," and the thunder answered like applause. When morning came, the world was drenched in clarity. The storm had washed away dust, doubt, and heaviness, leaving only the fragrance of renewal. God walked through it unseen, touching, raindrops still clinging to leaves, whispering thanks for what they had done. He felt lighter than ever, as though even he had been cleansed. He realized that rain, in its simplicity, was capable of doing what even light could not. It entered the deepest shadows and turned them gentle. "You've outgrown me," he said softly to the clouds, "and that's how I know I did well." But creation, in its loyalty, did not leave him behind. The next day, when sunlight broke through, the rain bent it into 7 perfect colors. A rainbow stretched across the sky, so vast and alive it seemed to breathe. God understood immediately. It was the sky's way of saying thank you. Each color was a memory: red for love, orange for courage, yellow for joy, green for growth, blue for trust, indigo for sorrow, violet for peace. Together they formed a covenant without words, a promise that even after the darkest storms, beauty would always return. God stood beneath that first rainbow for a long time, silent, almost human in his wonder. He felt the warmth of the sun mixing with the coolness of the rain, and for the first time, he experienced what it meant to be both giver and receiver of grace. It humbled him more deeply than anything else ever had. He touched the edge of the rainbow, and though his hand passed through it, he felt its vibration, a song of harmony between what falls and what rises. Perfect, he whispered, not because it lasts, but because it remembers. After that day, he no longer painted rain alone. The sky had learned its palette, the earth its rhythm, and humanity its meaning. He simply watched, listening to how every drop carried both his presence and its own. Centuries turned, ages passed, civilizations rose and vanished, but rain remained constant, the eternal heartbeat of renewal. It fell over temples and cities, over forests and ruins, over love and loss alike. It baptized every generation without asking for worship. And whenever someone stood in the rain, eyes closed, feeling the touch of something they couldn't name, God would smile. He knew they were feeling him, not as ruler, not as mystery, but as warmth disguised as water. Sometimes he would visit them quietly, stepping into the downpour beside them, invisible yet near. He'd whisper, "I'm still here," though they would only hear it as wind. It didn't matter. They always felt it, and that was enough, for that was how he wanted to be remembered, not as thunder or command, but as rain, gentle, recurring, always falling, always forgiving, always beginning again. And when he looked at the sky that night, filled with drifting clouds glowing faintly in moonlight, he realized he had painted not just the rain, but the endless story of love learning to fall without fear. The years passed in quiet circles, and the rain never forgot its origin. Each season carried the memory of God's brush, though the hand that had painted it no longer interfered. The sky had become its own artist now, learning to mix colors of emotion without needing command. Some rains fell like whispers of joy, others like unspoken apologies. And when the world was tired, the rain came as rest. God watched from the edge of existence, neither above nor within, but beside the rhythm of time itself. He no longer ruled the clouds. He listened to them. Sometimes they wept for the world, sometimes they laughed in thunder, but always they created beauty in motion. He loved that balance. How chaos and calm could dance in the same storm. He had once thought perfection meant stillness, but the rain had taught him otherwise, that perfection was movement in harmony. One evening, as the horizon burned softly in the orange haze of twilight, he felt something call him downward again. It wasn't a voice, not even a feeling, but a pull, like gravity made of memory. So he followed it, descending through layers of wind and silence until he reached the surface of a small meadow. It was raining lightly, each drop falling at its own pace, as if following a secret rhythm. The grass shimmered, the air trembled, and in the center of that meadow stood a single child, barefoot, hands open, face turned toward the sky. The child wasn't afraid of the rain. Instead, they were whispering to it, mouthing words that vanished into the sound of falling water. God watched, invisible, and listened. The child was thanking the rain, not for crops, not for rivers, but simply for existing. "Thank you," they said softly. "You sound like my mother when she sings." That sentence pierced God's heart like light through a cloud. He realized the rain had become part of language itself, part of comfort. It no longer just painted the earth, it painted memory into people. He approached the child in silence, the mist passing through his form, and knelt beside them. "Do you know who taught the rain to sing?" he asked softly. The child turned as if sensing him, though they saw only the shimmer of air. "No," they said, "but I think whoever did it must love us very much." God smiled, though unseen. "You're right." He wanted to stay longer, but he knew too much presence would break the magic. So he left a gift instead, a drop that lingered longer than all the others, resting on the child's palm. Inside that droplet shimmered every color of every sky. The child laughed softly, thinking it was a trick of the light. But that was how miracles usually worked. Small, humble, easily missed. God rose back into the clouds, watching how the child ran home through the field, trailing laughter and water in equal measure. That laughter echoed in his mind long after the rain ended. It reminded him that beauty meant nothing without someone to witness it. From then on, he painted the rain with witnesses in mind, with eyes, hearts, and souls that could receive its message. Every raindrop became not just an act of creation, but a conversation. He began whispering little truths into each rainfall, lessons hidden inside the rhythm. "You are not alone," he said through drizzle. "You are forgiven," he said through storms. "You are loved," he said through the softest mist. And the world listened, even when it didn't understand. Sometimes the answers came back in unexpected ways. Trees grew in the shape of prayers, rivers curved like open arms, and lightning carved ancient symbols across the sky that no human could read, but every heart could feel. He realized communication didn't always need comprehension. It only needed presence. One morning, as dawn rose gold and quiet, God wandered across the upper oceans of cloud. He noticed something strange, a section of sky trembling like liquid glass. Curious, he reached into it and found the memory of rain that had never fallen. These were drops that had formed but were never released, waiting for a moment that never came. They glowed faintly, filled with longing. God felt compassion for them, unfallen dreams, unrealized tears. So he opened his hand and let them go. The world below received them as a sudden soft shower, a rainfall that seemed to come from nowhere and end as gently as it began. Somewhere in that brief moment, an artist looked up from her window and began to paint. The canvas was blank a moment before, but now her brush moved as if guided by the sound. When she finished, she had painted a landscape no one had ever seen, a place of peace, blue and gold and quiet. God watched her work and realized that inspiration itself was rain, divine thought condensed into human creation. He laughed with wonder. So that's how they paint me back. From that day forward, he began to watch the artists of the world more closely. Musicians, poets, dreamers, all of them had water in their hearts, their tears, their passion, their creation. It all moved with the same rhythm he had once taught the clouds. When they cried, the sky cried too. When they rejoiced, the rain danced. It was as if humanity and heaven were mirrors reflecting each other's breath. But there was still something he hadn't painted: silence. Rain was sound, emotion, touch, but it was never absence. And yet, he wondered what silence within the rain might feel like. Could he make it still without killing its beauty? He pondered this for many dawns until the answer came, not as an idea, but as an accident. One morning, high above the mountains, frost formed on the edges of the rain. The droplets slowed, hardened, and drifted softly as snow. God watched in astonishment. "You changed yourself," he whispered. The rain had painted silence on its own. Snow was the rain's dream of stillness. It was the same essence, but asleep. It fell without sound, blanketing the world in calm. Children would wake to see the earth reborn, covered in purity. And though they didn't know it, they were walking on the sky's deep breath. God adored the invention. Snow taught the rain to rest, to pause between songs. And when it melted, the lesson flowed back into rivers, proof that even rest could lead to motion again. He saw the beauty of balance. He began to mix more variety into the sky's rhythm. Mist, drizzle, storm, hail, snow, dew. All versions of the same story told in different voices. It was his way of ensuring the world never grew bored of grace. Yet no matter how many forms the rain took, its heart remained the same. The gift of touch. That's what he loved most about it. Unlike light or wind, rain touched everything equally. It didn't choose where to fall. It blessed the just and the unjust, the sacred and the forgotten, the flowers and the stones. That is how I want to love, he thought, without preference, without limit. The realization filled him with warmth that even heaven couldn't contain. He decided to let himself be felt through the rain whenever the world needed it most. Not seen, not proven, just felt. That was the kind of faith he wanted humanity to discover, the kind that didn't need evidence, only recognition. Over the centuries, people began to notice. They built rituals around the rain. Some danced in it, some prayed for it, some sang to it. But the purest ones simply stood still and listened. And those were the ones who understood him best. They didn't seek miracles, they recognized them. To them, every drop was enough. God often lingered beside such souls, invisible but moved. He would watch their faces as they tilted upward, eyes closed, mouths slightly open, welcoming the rain like communion. It reminded him of the first child in the meadow. Time kept moving, but the same innocence returned in every generation. Rain became a bridge between what was and what would be. It carried the memory of beginnings and the promise of return. And in that realization, God saw that even he had entered the circle. He had created something that now sustained him too. Whenever he felt distant from creation, he would let himself drift into storms, feeling his own reflection in every drop. Sometimes he would dissolve entirely, becoming rain himself, falling silently into rivers, oceans, and human tears. It was his favorite form of prayer, to fall, to touch, to disappear, to rise again. Through that endless cycle, he learned humility deeper than any word could express. One night, he found himself in a city where neon lights replaced stars. It was raining heavily, but no one looked up. People hurried under umbrellas. Cars hissed across wet roads. Reflections trembled in puddles shaped by motion. God stood at a corner, unseen, and watched the scene unfold. He felt no anger, only tenderness. They had not forgotten him. They had simply grown too busy to notice the small ways he still whispered. So he tried something new. He sent a single droplet through the light of a passing car, bending it just enough so that it sparkled on the window of a woman who had stopped at a red light. The reflection looked like a heart. She noticed it, smiled faintly, and for no reason at all, felt lighter. That was enough. God whispered to himself, "Even unnoticed art can heal." The rain kept falling, endless, eternal, yet never the same twice. Some drops carried laughter, some grief, some new beginnings. God had long stopped counting them. He only listened now, to the sound of his creation singing itself alive, to the world he had painted continuing its masterpiece without needing him to guide every brushstroke. And as he listened, he felt peace deeper than silence. Peace that sounded like rain on rooftops, rivers, oceans, hearts. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wash through him, and in that infinite trembling music, he finally understood what he had been creating all along. It wasn't weather, it wasn't art. It was love learning to fall forever and never break. God drifted with the weather, until the map of the world felt like a palm he had memorized. Every river a line of destiny, every coastline a fingerprint of longing. And the rain continued its soft apprenticeship in love, learning a new dialect each time it touched a different land. And on a night when clouds lay low like wool around the shoulders of a sleeping mountain, he felt a tremor in the hush, a tiny shiver the way silence moves when it is about to speak. So he leaned closer and listened, and within the hush he heard the smallest sound, dew forming, a drop gathering itself on the lip of a blade of grass until gravity and courage were the same, and then letting go. The fall was no bigger than a breath, but the earth received it as if it were a star, and God understood again that magnitude was a trick of distance, that the smallest falls carry the most intimate truths. And he walked through the meadow of that mountain where fog made the world seem kindly unfinished. And he traced his finger along spider silk strung between two humble stems, each strand beaded with patient pearls, little altars of arrival. And when a breeze nudged the web, the beads slid and kissed and parted like travelers sharing a blessing at a crossroads. And it pleased him to see water learn choreography from the quietest teachers. He felt then that the rain was ready for a deeper task, not only to soften, to carve, to cleanse, but to remember on behalf of all who could not. So he gave the raindrops a new memory, not of places, not of names, but of thresholds, those fragile lines where someone becomes someone else, a child tall enough to see over a windowsill for the first time, a farmer laying down a tool at season's end, a widow closing a door and opening a window to the scent of wet stone. And he whispered into the cloud, "When they cross, accompany them." And the cloud did, sending drizzle that folded around shoulders like a shawl. And in that soft escort, the world found itself brave without knowing why. Later, when dawn unbuttoned the seam of horizon, he walked into a coastal town whose streets were narrow and whose roofs wore moss like old stories. And it rained the kind of rain that turns footsteps into watercolor, edges into kindness. And he watched a baker sweep his threshold as if sweeping a stage before the first note, and two students share an umbrella that kept their books dry but let their laughter get wet, and an old sailor pause, hat in hand, to consider how the harbour smells like both farewell and welcome when it rains. God closed his eyes to savour the layered chords of morning, the hiss of tyres, the drip from eaves, the distant gulls stitching commas into the melody. And he noticed that rain carried punctuation, that storms were exclamation, mist was ellipsis, showers were commas between thoughts, and clearings were tender periods that did not end a paragraph so much as rest it. Sometimes, he thought, the kindest thing love can do is give a sentence back its breath. And he let that thought wander into the sky, where it became a brightness behind the clouds, the sort of light that doesn't announce itself so much as make everything else truer. In the interior of the continent, far from salt and gulls, there was a river that had forgotten its original bed, and rain had been guiding it patiently for centuries, not forcing, only showing. And now, in a spring swollen with decision, the river finally turned, shouldered aside its old certainty, and found a new path that ran closer to villages that needed it. And God felt pride the way a gardener feels it when a vine finds the trellis on its own. And he murmured, "Yes," which the thunder repeated more dramatically than necessary. But that is thunder's nature, and no one minded. He moved on and found a desert where rain was a rumor that hope told itself at night. And he knelt and pressed his palm into the sand until a coolness rose, and he whispered a schedule into the winds, rare but faithful, so that when rain did come, it would come like a promise kept. And the desert learned to hold moisture in seeds and roots and stone hollows, becoming a scripture of restraint, proof that abundance is sometimes best told in the grammar of enough, and in that basin a child would someday see a storm ripen on the horizon and say, "It is our turn," and the rain would answer, "Always." Then God remembered snow, the rain's dream of silence, and he returned to a valley of winter where homes glowed in the blue hour and smoke rose like patient prayers, and he watched snow fall with its unarguable gentleness, each flake a decision to be soft, and he thought of how softness is never weakness when it chooses itself. And he breathed on a window so a small hand inside could draw a heart on the fog, and as the little hand did, flakes clung to the glass outside in the same shape, as if echoing the gesture, and the child laughed, and laughter in winter is how rooms become hearths. He walked into cities where neon wrote hurried poems on wet asphalt, and he learned that rain is the only critic whose review every building reads, because every wall grows darker, more honest, under its touch. In one such city, a dancer rehearsed alone with rain tapping the roof like a metronome, and when a leak found a bucket, the bucket answered with a pitch so clean the dancer built an entire phrase around it. Heel, toe, breath, the fall of water setting the tempo of courage. And God felt that old astonishment to be discovering his own work inside another's work, which is to say, he felt human, which is to say, he felt at home. He crossed mountains where storms wore armor and spoke in drums, and he let the lightning write calligraphy along the ridge, brief and eloquent, letters no alphabet could cage, and the goats stood unafraid because goats understand that loudness is not always danger, and he learned from them that discernment is the quiet twin of bravery. He took this lesson to a coastline where the tide argued, as tides do, with the moon, and rain arrived to moderate, and he watched sea and sky shake hands on the skin of waves, and he thought of treaties, of the accords hearts can sign without paper when they stand in weather together and decide to forgive. He visited a garden in the first red hour of autumn, when everything smells like the inside of an apple, and rain glossed the leaves as if the trees were sealing letters. And he listened to a grandfather tell a story about how he once misread a storm and still arrived safely, and the child asked if safety was luck, and the old man said it was grace, and the rain chimed agreement in the gutters. And in a monastery high up where silence is not avoidance but devotion, he found monks sweeping water from stone steps with the same humility they used for prayer. And he thought how work and worship are two syllables of the same word. And he blessed the brooms, because brooms teach hands to be gentle with endings. He turned to the equator where afternoons collapse into sudden rain like applause for the day's bravery. And he slipped between towering leaves to watch how drops gathered into veins, how colour became more itself when wet. And he bent close to a hummingbird's pause under the leaf's shelter, a tiny sanctuary that proved even speed needs refuge. And he wrote a rule for himself in the wet air. Make shelter part of the miracle, not an afterthought. In the north, where auroras dream out loud, he watched sleet sketch cuneiform on windows and felt the sting that makes cheeks honest. And he gave the storm a softer exit so the night could exhale, and people would step out to hear snow give its small compliments to the dark. He knelt at a graveyard where rain gave privacy to grief by making the whole world weep. And he tucked a quiet into the downpour so that memories could walk without, limping. And he returned at sunrise to find the stones cleaned, the names readable again, because remembrance is a kind of rain that falls upward when the living speak the departed back into the room. He wandered then to schools where children pressed hands against the panes to feel the glass buzz with weather. And he let a bolt of far thunder stretch their curiosity without snapping it. And he added a note to the teacher's voice that said, without words, "It's all right to stare out the window sometimes. Learning needs horizons." He found a hospital where rain softened the sterile into bearable, and he traced small rivers down the exterior, so rooms felt like maps toward better shores. And the nurses walked quicker, but their eyes gentled, and he made the streetlights bloom halos on the asphalt, so ambulances carried their own stars. He took a long road that had forgotten its ending, and reined along it until wildflowers remembered the margins and returned to decorate the journey, and he smiled, because beauty at the edges is how roads confess they are guests, not rulers. Then he rose high where jets carve white signatures and looked down at a country between tempers, and he let a front pass through, not to punish, but to reset the light, to wash the air of old arguments so people could disagree without inheritance. And he marveled again at how weather is not command but invitation, not verdict but rehearsal for gentleness. He returned to the first meadow where the first child had thanked the rain, and now a grown soul, perhaps that child, perhaps any child enlarged by time, stood in a drizzle that had the decency to arrive without spectacle. And the grown soul closed their eyes and whispered thanks in a voice that contained 1,000 rooms, and God stood beside them, both of them hearing how each drop is a syllable in a language that refuses conquest. And he wanted to say, "I am here," but knew the rain was already saying it better, so he was quiet, and in that quiet he felt complete. Yet even completeness moved, because love disliked stasis, and he thought of the raindrop perched on the grass blade, the courage of letting go, and he gave that courage to a city about to vote, to a parent about to apologize, to an artist about to show the unshowable, and all of them, in their separate weathers, found themselves falling and learning the miracle that the ground is not an end, but a beginning, shaped like a rival. Twilight gathered, and he threaded a filament of gold through the cloud, so the last 30 drops glowed as they fell, and people watching from doorways and buses and porches felt, for a reason they could not name, that it had been a good day for the world to be the world. And God let that be the benediction, simple as damp hair and steaming streets, because benedictions are strongest when they borrow their verbs from ordinary things. Night leaned in, and street puddles became astronomy. Constellations trembled under passing feet, and he watched. Lovers placed their faces close enough that the rain had to part around them, and he thought, here is the holiest architecture, 2 foreheads making a roof, 4 eyes making a window, and the sky, instead of resenting, blessing the shelter. He drifted one last time across oceans where rain faintly dimples infinity, and he listened to whales carry thunder down to where light is rumour. And he blessed the rumour because rumours of light are sometimes all a creature needs to keep swimming. And he let the storm spend itself, and the calm afterward raised a scent so clean it felt like a vow. And he took that vow into himself, and he slept, not to escape the world, but to keep dreaming it kindly. And as he slept, the rain kept falling with the competence of grace, and in every place it touched, something yielded without losing itself, and every threshold remembered how to open, and every closed eye learned to trust the sound of being cared for by a sky that refuses to forget the ground. When the world had almost forgotten the sound of beginnings, when the mountains wore their crowns of mist like thoughts too ancient to speak, God returned one final time to the place where the first drop had ever fallen. The valley was older now, but age had not dimmed its colour, it had only deepened it. The rivers that once whispered now sang with layered memory, the stones carried the fingerprints of centuries, and the trees stood like quiet witnesses to everything that had ever been washed, broken, healed, and born again. The sky waited. It knew this was not a storm to fear, nor a blessing to request. It was the remembering of the first promise, the echo that comes only when all echoes have returned home. God stood still and looked around him. The brush he had once left hanging in the clouds was gone. The sky, it seemed, no longer needed tools. It painted itself now, and the rain was its language. He breathed in the scent of wet soil, the fragrance of time itself, and he felt every life that had ever lifted its face to the sky. Children, mothers, strangers, wanderers, kings, the lonely and the loved, all had shared the same baptism of ordinary grace. Every drop that had ever fallen had touched someone's story, and now all those stories flowed back to him. He could feel them in his chest, not as noise, but as harmony. It was the sound of everything that had ever lived, speaking together without words. He closed his eyes and let it fill him. The first rain had been creation. The last, he thought, might be understanding. For what was the difference? To create is to understand what must exist. To understand is to love what already does. He raised his hand to the clouds, but not to command them, only to greet them as equals. "You've done beautifully," he whispered. "You've loved this world better than I could have planned." The clouds trembled softly in reply, and the rain began to fall. Not heavy, not light, perfect. Each drop was deliberate, unhurried, certain of its purpose. It fell across oceans and deserts, across the laughter of cities and the prayers of ruins. It touched the skin of every living being, and for a single moment in eternity, everything that breathed did so in rhythm. Even time itself seemed to inhale. God felt the pulse of the universe slow, as though the world was exhaling after a long dream. He smiled. The rain glowed faintly as it fell, not bright like lightning, but soft like memory, the kind of light you feel more than see. It slid down petals, faces, roofs, rivers, and even through the cracks of forgotten windows, entering the corners of rooms where people kept their quietest thoughts. And everywhere it touched, it said the same thing: "You are loved." It said it to the smallest root, to the deepest stone, to the drift in dust, and to the star reflected in a puddle. It said it to every living cell that had ever been afraid. It was not a command, not even a comfort, just truth returning home. God knelt and pressed his palm to the ground, feeling his own reflection ripple through the wet earth. He realized that he was no longer above creation, nor outside it. He was within it completely, dissolved in the endless exchange of falling and rising. "This," he said softly, "is what I wanted to become." He had not painted the rain to be worshipped. He had painted it to understand himself. And now he did. The rain had shown him everything he needed to know: how to let go, how to return, how to love without possession, how to be both the painter and the painted. He thought of the first child in the meadow, of the woman who smiled at a single drop on her window, of the storms that had frightened and the drizzles that had healed. He thought of laughter echoing through puddles and tears that had mingled with rainfall until heaven and heart were indistinguishable. All of it was him, and none of it was him. And that paradox felt like peace. The sky dimmed into silver quiet, and somewhere far below, the ocean caught the falling rain and lifted it back up in steam, sending it home again. The cycle completed itself like a breath. God whispered, "Thank you," not to the clouds, not to himself, but to everything. The words were not heard. They were felt in the pattern of the rain, encoded forever in every drop that would ever fall again. He stood slowly, the mist wrapping around him like an old friend. The horizon flickered with the faintest rainbow, not bright, not loud, just a shimmer of continuity, a signature written in color. It stretched so wide that it seemed to touch the edges of all hearts at once. God watched it fade until only the air remained, glowing with the faint aftertaste of divinity. Then, gently, he disappeared into the drizzle. Not vanished, not gone, just part of it. And though no one could see him anymore, everyone who stood in the rain from that day forward would feel something different. A calm they couldn't name, a memory they'd never lived, a warmth in the cold. That was him. He had not left, he had returned everywhere. And so the rain fell, as it always had and always will, painting the world not with color, but with belonging. The rivers carried his silence, the oceans carried his laughter, the clouds carried his heartbeat, and every drop, from the first to the last, carried the same promise, that love, once released, never ends. It only changes form. Somewhere a window closed, a candle flickered, and the rain kept falling, slow, soft, endless, until the night turned blue with peace, and the world, freshly painted, went to sleep under God's final masterpiece.